and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. This week, I'm delighted to welcome back the most recent of many visits to these studios, David Starkey. David, I can call you a friend of the channel, I think. Now,
it's a personal friend. I mean, let's stretch it a bit.
Stretch it a bit. No, it's just great to see you, particularly at the moment as well, because this is going out on Sunday. We have next week, of course, the result, I think, of what seems to have been an interminable Conservative Party leadership contest. I wanted to start by asking you, really, have you been surprised at the level of interest that there has been? Because a lot of people originally were thinking that this was almost just like some sideshow going on, but it seems to have generated a bit more than that.
Well, I think it's very simple, isn't it? Yeah. What looked to be an overwhelming Labour majority has turned into a sham majority. Yeah. We were sitting here. Yeah. Was it the day after the result came out? Mm. And I pointed out that only 1 in 5 people had actually voted for them. Now, that would not have mattered if they had done what they said they were going to do, if there'd been a triumphal progress, and if they demonstrated the alleged competence, the vast quantities of legislation ready, if they'd seized that famous phrase, the seizing of the narrative, if Starmer had been another Blair. Now, none of that's happened. So suddenly, the Conservatives have become interesting for the very simple fact that Labour's gone down. Yeah. It's been shown in the simplest ways. We've seen the collapse of Labour in the opinion polls, the collapse of Starmer in particular, the results of council elections. Very, very significant numbers of Conservative gains. So obviously the Conservative Party, far from being a dead parrot, has suddenly shown itself to being rather a lively bird when it's flapping its wings. And I'm obviously speaking from the inside, from somebody who was determined actually to resuscitate the thing. So I'm very pleased. And it's not simply, I think, that the leadership contest is attracting attention. I think its very length has actually turned out to be rather a good thing. What it's done is to re-engage with the membership. Particularly one of the candidates in particular, Robert Jenrick, has toured the country in a spectacular fashion. In other words, very much the sort of politics that we're seeing going on in America at the moment.
Yes.
Where this phrase now, the 4 nations, the determination to go to every corner of the United Kingdom. He has been doing that. Again, what's very striking is the atmosphere. I was at the party conference. My friend said, "Oh, for God's sake, why are you going there?
Yes.
It'll be the most depressing thing." And indeed, aspects of Birmingham. Now, that was depressing.
In that kind of shopping mall. Isn't it?
Unspeakable. This is a monument to a Conservative mayor, to Andy Street. It seems to me to show that really the one thing Andy Street should never be allowed to do is build anything again. It's a study not only in hideousness but complete inconvenience. But despite the building, despite the continuous rain, the atmosphere was extraordinary, not in the conference hall. It was a kind of inverse conference. Yeah. In the conference hall, there was nothing until the last act when the 2 candidates appeared on stage. Remember, 2 of them only had survived that very lengthy process of elimination by MPs as they'd been whittled down from, what was it? Was it 5? Was it 7?
Yes, ridiculous amount.
I can't remember what it was. And so there were just the 2 of them. But it was the fringe. The fringe meetings, many of them were extraordinarily well attended.
Did you speak at one of them?
Yes, 2. And there were queues around the block. And the passionate engagement, involvement, very striking large numbers of young people. And there was a sense, I suppose, of a kind of liberation. There was also a sense of rebellion. There was the feeling that the party had been gagged. It had been gagged by its leadership. It had been gagged by office. It had been gagged by central office. And all those gags were broken. So there was a real sense of rediscovery, debate, argument.
You've never really wavered have you in your belief in the Tory party? I don't mean sort of indiscriminately in terms of belief, but you see it as being basically the only true vehicle for concern.
I think it's the only plausible vehicle. I also take another view, which is the idea of sweeping the Conservative Party aside, which is one of the great historic parties. We're now talking about a history, depending on where you date it, of 200 or even 300 years. It's part of that process which was so, which reached its apogee or its pits rather. It's not an apogee, it's a good thing. It pits, which is a very bad one, under Tony Blair, of saying, oh, just let's get rid of it. It's old-fashioned. This is a profound error. The approach in a country which is historic like ours, and it's not a fossilized history. We happen still to be one of the great we may no longer be a great power in the conventional physical sense of the word, with a shrunken army and navy and whatever, but as a creative place. And by that, I don't just mean people daubing graffiti all over the place. I mean in the proper arts and sciences, in everything from history to biology. We remain an astonishingly creative place precisely because of our history. It's no accident that our two great historic universities are the ones where the most new and creative things happen. And I see the need to reshape the Conservative Party, not destroy it, as essentially part of that. And indeed, I am a passionate believer that revolutionary change is always disastrous. I mean, let's just shall we have two illustrations of this, because I think they're very important. Why is the National Health Service such a mess? Because they decided to start from scratch. In 1945, we had a highly functioning system of healthcare that was exactly what you have in continental Europe, with a remarkable range of different institutions, many of them richly endowed, particularly in London. We had, the great teaching hospitals were heavily endowed. They commanded enormous resources of charity. There was major royal intervention through things like the King's Fund. There were local hospitals. There were the counties and what. I remember my early experiences, because I was born with club feet, so I had very early encounters with medicine when the Westmoreland County Hospital. So there was, which again had been built out of local subscription. So there was, so all of the things that we now admire in continental Europe were there. We just decided with this terrible fascination of the 1940s onwards for sweeping away. It's exactly the same with the rebuilding of our towns. We were talking about Birmingham. Why is Birmingham such a horror? Because we knocked most of it down. Yes. Look in the European towns, and they are the European cities. The ones that flourish most are the ones that have taken most care of their history. It's very simple. Let's a final example before we get back to your question.
Sorry,
no, but these are all very, very important things. Yes. Let's take another example. Why are our prisons in the catastrophic mess that they are now? Because of yet another sweeping away. Labour swept away the unique and peculiar office of Lord Chancellor. This was the most prestigious member of the cabinet, apart from the Prime Minister, and he often outweighed him. He was one of the most senior and distinguished lawyers of his age. You're in Mackay of Clashfern, under Margaret Thatcher, Derry Irving, under Tony Blair. They carried a weight. They acted as a kind of universal bridge between the legal system, the political system, and the House of Lords, in both its judicial capacity and in terms of its legislative capacity. And they represented the absolutely central importance of justice. Abolish that office, give it to people like Chris Grayling and Liz Truss, and look what happens. Again, we've lost sight of what the fundamental purposes of government are. They are defence and they are justice.
Yeah.
Going right back to the beginning of time, those are the two things that a functioning government should centre on. And it was the great oath of a medieval king, to fight and to judge. That is the task of a king. And it's this sweeping away which has been so catastrophic. So back to why we shouldn't sweep away the Tory party, and it's showing every sign of not being swept away.
Perhaps as well, on a much more prosaic day-to-day level, it wasn't kind of defeated badly enough. I mean, it got 120 seats. If it had gone below 100, maybe it would have been a different story. But it was just, Labour didn't do quite as well, and the Tories did a bit better. But that's, now getting to be ancient history in terms of politics. Okay, so we've got this Tory party that you see being alive and should survive. Who would you prefer to see as the leader next weekend?
I think the important thing to say is that there are two impressive candidates who both have serious qualities. And let's deal with them in the inverse order to my preference. Let's begin with Kemi Badenoch. She is eloquent, she's forceful, she's brave, she's got an interesting mind. She did a very difficult university subject, or she didn't just...
What was it actually?
She did some form of engineering. I think it was some form of in the old days it would have been known as electrical engineering. It's now some form of computerized stuff, whatever. But a really serious, a really difficult degree. She's interested in ideas. She actually circulated as part of her leadership campaign this enormously long pamphlet, which is putting together really two sets of ideas that we are both familiar with, the ideas of David Goodhart on the one hand and Matt Goodwin on the other. And it's properly researched. I gather it was written by an academic at Bristol. It's got pages and pages of footnotes. This is somebody, in other words, who has, not only in her sex, not only in her style, something of Margaret Thatcher about her, that desire to engage with serious ideas, and that ability to absorb them, and that ability to communicate them, as well as to cut mere men down at the knees, which I regard as a wholly good thing. So there's somebody there with real quality. My problem with Badenoch, or Badenoch, apparently the favourite phrase is there's nothing bad in Badenoch. Badenoch, my problem with her is who is supporting her. Anybody who is supported by William Hague and Baroness Wassey and the whole of the surviving left of the Conservative Party fills me with horror. This is the kind of embalmment of everything that's gone wrong with the Conservative Party for the last 14 years. So the one, again, let's look at the other chap. Let's look at Jenrick. Well, I mean, Jenrick, frequently denounced as Tory boy. He did indeed go to Cambridge, but he's from very much the same sort of background, dare one say it, as Keir Starmer. Indeed, his father may almost have been a toolmaker. He's a product of a decent education, but he is rather unashamedly provincial. He is a Midlander and rather proud of it. He is also somebody who's changed his mind. Now, I regard changing your mind as being a rather good thing. You remember, he used to be known as Jenrick because he was so absolutely all-purpose, promoted by the left of the party, achieving significant office under Sunak and whatever. But he was put in charge, effectively, of implementing the Rwanda scheme. And he, of course, discovered that it couldn't be done. Yeah. That the civil service, the legal establishment, the whole machinery of law, in particular the European Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention or whatever, made what was an absolutely necessary policy. That is to say, we were talking about the fundamental purposes of the state. One is to distinguish between the citizen and the alien. It is to maintain the frontier. Why do you and I, highly respectable people, in my case, somebody whose face is usually recognized when I come up to immigration, why do we have to show a passport? Because the frontier is properly guarded. Why do those on boats of no reputation, and very often an ill reputation, why do they simply sail in? Why can't we stop them? He recognized that as a problem, and he did something rather remarkable. He resigned about it. And I was in the House, obviously in the public gallery. I was supposed to be having lunch with my old friend Bill Cash, and he wanted to speak in the debate, so he bribed me. The Houses of Parliament is built on one sort of bribery, another. And he gave me the seat of the Speaker's Gallery, where you have this wonderful perspective, the whole of the House. I never really, in that awful phrase, clocked Jenrick before at all. He got up and he absolutely took over the debate. He did what you should do in a debate. He'd only a tiny, he didn't do what most parliamentarians do now. One of these dreadful prepared speeches. He'd listened. He summarized where the debate had got to. He adduced his own experience. He talked about why he'd changed his mind, what had made him change his mind, and then he sent the debate off in the direction that he wanted. And he did all that in the amount of time that's allowed to a backbencher, which he was at that point. I thought that was seriously impressive. I said at that point to Chris Chope, who was then with the Telegraph, now with GB News, I said, that is a future leader of the party or Prime Minister. So I'm on record as saying it, and I believe it.
How long was it that he actually resigned before Sunak went?
Oh, he resigned in December or January. I'm talking, this is early January.
But so, I mean, with some justification, a lot of people say, oh, this is just typical Tory behaviour, saying all these great things. And some of them have been brilliant, I would say, some of the things he's come out with. But that basically it's what they do just before any kind of election. But you really think that this was absolutely a Damascene conversion, do you?
Can I remind you what the word Damascene conversion
I knew,
comes
as I
from?
said that, actually.
It is the conversion.
I knew.
It is the conversion of St. Paul.
Right.
St. Paul underwent a bigger conversion than Robert Jenrick. Paul had been one of the leading persecutors of Christianity. He then becomes its most eloquent formulator, I would argue, more so than Jesus. The church that we have now, the Christianity that we have now, is essentially the work of St. Paul, for better and, in my view, for worse, because he melds Christianity with Greco-Roman philosophy and so on. But what is remarkable about Jenrick is exactly that. He changed his mind. But isn't it a wholly good thing? Let's cite Maynard Keynes, whose consequences in many ways were dreadful. The famous remark, when the facts change, I change my mind. Don't you? He has also gone out so far that there is no way he can preserve any credibility.
Oh, that's fair enough. Yes.
And we were talking actually before we went on air, weren't we, about the things that he's been saying about the Chris Carber affair, about Rotherham.
Well, actually, that was one. I don't want to pick that up, actually, though. So this is where he said that basically there should be, whole-scale prosecutions, and that people who were involved in, if you like, covering up or doing nothing about the grooming gangs should never be allowed, near any kind of public
He was talking about the machinery in local government. He was talking about the machinery in the DPP. And it seems to me, and in the police.
Yes.
Because, in other words, what he was doing, he was addressing the connivance of the blob in all of this. And I think this is an absolutely fundamental part of Robert's message, that one of the reasons things have gone so badly wrong is we have a machinery of government, which is, and by the way, it's also, let me try and be fair, Kemi Badenoch is saying exactly the same thing. The machinery of government is perverted and it's corrupted. It is not doing what it should. We saw it with the shocking failure to to prosecute the guys. Not only in Rotherham, I mean in Rochdale, in Oldham,
Everywhere.
all over the North and the Midlands. And again, on exactly the same grounds, these grounds of community cohesion, which really means kid gloves for immigrants. But in fact, two-tier, not simply two-tier justice, two-tier everything.
Yes.
And in other words, simply, and it is actually a problem, you know, of the British and the English in particular. We don't really expect foreigners to behave. I remember, let me tell you a little story so we get ourselves away from these delicate things. And it's also good to use humour.
I want to come back and talk about
also very good to use humour to make a point. I'm going right back to my early days in London when I was at LSE, and we had the London School of Economics, and we had that enormously overrated German, Rafe Darendorf, as director of the school. And the food at LSE was indescribably awful. And he used to hold these dreadful dinners there was a particular director's dining room that was lined in some particular kind of wood effect formica, vile rum and vile food. The only thing you could eat at these dinners was the pudding. And we would all be getting the pudding on the table. The moment the pudding had gone on the table, Darendorf, who disgracefully had been served first, would actually get up, get out, do it, and would lift up his spoon, would strike the table and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, they are not here simply for the sensual pleasures, but to discuss the future of the school." Now, if an Englishman, all your food was taken away at that point, as we all screamingly hungry. Now, if an Englishman had done that, he would have been torn limb from limb.
Yes,
we just said, "Oh, he's a German."
Yeah.
And I'm afraid we've adopted that general attitude.
Yeah.
And it's very strikingly different from most European countries. It is because we were once so confident about our identities.
Can I just press you?
But let's go back. Let's go back to the substantive point. But I was just trying to make trying to make the point of tolerance. What he's saying is that people should actually be held to account. And we've seen this. We've seen it in every institution. We see it in the NHS. We've been seeing it shockingly at Great Ormond Street. I mean, I feel passionately about that. This is the surgeon who's been doing to children the operation that was done to me. The smashing of the bones to lengthen the leg. I had it done. I know what it's like. I owe the fact I lead a normal life to the brilliance, the patience, and the skill of a particular surgeon. I can still remember his name. I would still recognize him from nearly 80 years ago. And for, as it were, there to be a cover-up from a bad, destructive, cruel surgeon is a scandal. And everywhere we look, there is this idea that what matters is reputation. There is this closing of doors. There is this coming together. It is the old phrase, you circle wagons. And Robert is determined to break that down.
Okay.
And again, we see it now. It's particularly the problem, right? Why, again, do I have great hopes for the Conservative Party? Precisely because the Labour Party, and Starmer in particular, represents that circling of wagons. The Labour Party represents this self-satisfied, overprivileged public sector, and everybody's wakening up to it. We're seeing every single thing, even taxation, is now quite deliberately unfair between the public and the private sector. Okay, we're going to do things to pensions. Oh, but we're not going to do it to NHS doctors, are we? We are not going to do it to senior civil servants, are we? So it's not simply there's two-tier policing, there's two-tier everything. When Starmer talked about the public service, what he really meant was the public sector. They are privileged, they are virtuous. Again, it's this absurd notion that was embodied during COVID, in which we were all supposed to die to save the NHS.
Yes.
And, the complete absurdity that it's your job to save the NHS. This is the complete inversion of values. And Robert, I think, is much more directly than Kemi, and also doing it in a very different way. Robert is doing it not simply as a grand generalized statement of something must be done. These are my principles. He is saying these are the concrete things I intend to do. And he is spelling them out clearly. He's spelling them out on paper. He's doing, in other words, exactly, this is where the resemblance to Margaret Thatcher reverses. One of the most extraordinary documents I've read recently is the Conservative Manifesto for 1979. Thatcher's
I remember
great
it, actually.
victory. It is an astonishing document. It's first of all beautifully written, and it is totally specific in first the diagnosis of what had gone wrong and the recommendations. It specifies the legislation to be repealed, the things that are to be done, the measures that need to be taken. Robert is doing just that.
I take it from that you would prefer him, obviously, to be the winner.
Yes, I mean, that's my view. But as I said, I will not weep my eyes out.
Yeah, but can I just to add to that, you said that the problem with Kemi is that essentially she is being supported by, look at her friends, as it were. She's being supported by the West. That also includes Tory party members, by the sounds of it.
It will include some. I mean, sorry.
Well, no, apparently she's just way ahead, isn't she? When it comes to membership.
I think the evidence is that it is going to be a very close run contest. That is what all the latest on ground, as it were, sampling suggests. And I think that is a fair statement. I'm not just talking one side up, and I'm not just talking another side down. But I think we need to make a very important point. Margaret Thatcher didn't take the Tory party with her completely. She was for the whole of the way. And there remained absolute centres of resistance. And that awful man, Fat Peng, Chris Patten, who's just resigned, thank heavens, as Chancellor of Oxford, was the head of the Centre for Policy Studies. Conservative Research Department. Let me get that right. The Conservative Research Department, and they fought her tooth and nail. There were the wets in the cabinet, and the change in politics is a very difficult thing. There are people's careers have been made. There are patronage networks. I mean, we've been talking about them. And people, the so-called grandees, the David Camerons and the George Osbornes of this world, still retain influence. They still have networks of allegiance. They can still pull strings. It would be very surprising if it were anything else. But my sense is that there is now, as exactly there was for Thatcher in 79, between 75 when she becomes leader and 79, there is a momentum in the direction of change. I think there's also an intellectual shift going on. I think which actually Jenrick and Badenoch themselves, and let's be fair, Reform are all playing a part in it.
Do you think that there would be some sort of this coalition between Reform, or is it not necessary anymore to the Tories? This idea that at some stage they've got to kind of join up. I mean, it seems to me at the moment, for the reasons we've just outlined with Robert Jenrick, that they are basically outflanking Nigel Farage on the issues that people are really angry about at the moment. Jenrick, some of the things he said. So therefore, one would assume that they're kind of going to go straight for it, that they're not going to look to kind of...
I think this is a matter of electoral calculation, and it's absurd to come up with, to try to forecast a situation that we will be in. I mean, the position is this. It is likely that in exactly the same way the governments of Harold Wilson and James Callaghan staggered on. I think, let's just try and get a chronology. I think we are literally in the direct 50-year cycle on from the 1970s. We are exactly what? We are exactly 50 years on from the defeat of Edward Heath in the first general election of 1974.
February.
The first general.
And then there was another one in October.
And then with a much more significant majority going to Harold Wilson then. That was the moment at which the debate, exactly the debate that's now taking place in the Conservative Party. There was the predecessor debate. This is the moment at which Keith Joseph has that another Damascene conversion, in which he actually says, I had called myself a Conservative. I had been a leading member. I'd been a cabinet minister in a Conservative government, but the government wasn't Conservative and I wasn't Conservative. And he then set about using primarily the work of Friedrich Hayek. He set about reconstructing a view of free market economics as the basis of conservatism. And Margaret Thatcher was elected as leader the following year, and he worked on her. He set up the Centre for Policy Studies, and the whole process, which working with the IEA, came up with the policies which were to bring inflation under control, to sort out the power of the trade unions, to break up the great masses of local authority housing with council house sales, all of those things that were implemented from 1979. So I think, and of course, what we've got to remember is that that victory of Harold Wilson in 1974 was followed by what? It was followed by the Healey budget and the catastrophe of 1976, when we had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund in circumstances very similar to what is going on now. Yes. The unleashing of the trade unions and the unleashing of the public sector and vast wage increases. And we remember we hit 25% inflation. And I think my own guess is, I don't know whether you follow the bond market rates. Sterling bonds are in free fall. That's to say, rates are going up very sharply. And Reeves, this economist apparently who only worked in the complaints department at Eighth Boss, and as somebody cleverly said, that means she'll be well prepared for what follows the budget, even if she's got no qualifications. Actually, it's a really nice one to put it together. She, I think, is going to unleash those forces. I mean, there's going to be grotesquely excessive borrowing. So, in other words, the question is whether a government that, as it were, has already spent its political capital. It's already spent its political capital. That is a product of a pure fluke in the electoral system. We'll see. I imagine my forecast will be that the May Council elections will see a Labour wipeout. I think it is virtually certain that we'll see the Labour wipeout. In other words, it may very well be, because of its political fragility, it won't see out its term to 2029. But it is more likely to do than not. But we have then, in other words, we've got no idea what the political situation will look like in 2029. My guess is that if the Conservative Party position itself properly, it will be exactly the same as with Brexit. And what Farage will have done is what Farage does best. He's an agent provocateur. He, as it were, he acts, or if you like, he's like one of these famous burrowing machines, these moles that go under the ground and create hundreds of millions of pounds of cost for HS2. He is the thing that drills out a new policy, and then the Conservative Party drifts in that direction. And so that is my guess is what will happen. I don't think reform will disappear completely. I think in practice it is more likely than not that there will be some sort of electoral pact. In other words, pretty much what happened in 2019. And remember, we all talk of this as though it's something terribly un-British. The Conservative Party is a product of this. The whole business of it's why it's called the Conservative and Unionist Party.
You're talking about I'm interested in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
And then of course after the 1974 we had those elections, but then Thatcher was elected opposition leader that following
75,
year.
75, yeah.
what she had then, as you mentioned actually, was this extraordinary kind of intellectual basis. She listened, apparently. She listened to people like the people next door at the Centre for Policy Studies. And you have people...
Well, it was set up. So the CPS is actually set up precisely to do that.
Right, and there were these people like Keith Joseph. What seems to characterise so much of our political culture now is that, and it's been remarked on many times, is that the parties are here and the thinkers or whatever are quite disconnected. We don't have that in America, where they're still very connected, but they're very disconnected. Where are the influences for whether it's Jenrick or
one of them is
maybe
sitting,
you know a few
one
of
of them is sitting opposite you.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I am seeing it very much as my task.
Yeah.
One of the, again, emerging from the wreckage of this year, one of the more interesting organizations is, again, founded by the former head of the IEA, Mark Littlewood, PopCon, Popular Conservatism. And I seem to be playing it's flattering enough to describe me as its brain, and I've been playing a part in trying to do exactly what we're talking about, to provide exactly the same sort of careful analysis of what's gone wrong. Remember, the first thing you've got to do before you can put anything right is to determine what's gone wrong. It's rather like medicine. You have to diagnose before you can have your prescription. And the diagnosis that I am offering, why things... Because remember, it's not simply that one or two things have gone wrong in Britain. There is this sense of omnishambles.
Yeah.
There is this sense of everything going wrong.
Breakdown.
Of general breakdown, of nothing working. And I think there is a quite clear and systematic reason for this. And remember, there's something very unusual about this. Until very recently, Britain was regarded as being probably the best governed country in the world. We actually provide the model of representative democracy to the rest of the world. The very fact that the term parliament is used so universally and so on. We actually create that model. The reputation still of our legal system is unparalleled and so on. We create that machinery. And what has gone wrong? Why has the civil service turned from the Rolls Royce into this clapped out larder? And what's gone wrong? Well, the answer, it seems to me, is that we destroyed the old machine. Again, one of the things that we've forgotten, and it's very, very easy to forget, because, of course, in many ways, the purposes of government have changed. That because of the complete shift in the budget towards welfare, towards the NHS, we've, in many ways, I think, forgotten what the really big things in government are. The immigrant crisis, the crisis of our borders and whatever, the sudden now profound insecurity of the world. Again, we were able to indulge the whole business of all that matters, is welfare, because, of course, we had the collapse of our enemy, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the whole illusory triumph of the West that has its most egregious and triumphalist form in the very appropriately named Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history in 1989. We had all of that, and suddenly it's gone wrong. And what I think went wrong is exactly what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did in that very, very long stretch from 1979 to 2010. What we had before that point was a highly functioning system of representative government in which I am the last person to regard MPs or whatever as perfect human beings. But there's one crucially important thing about them: you can throw them out, as we indeed rightly happened to most Conservative MPs earlier this year. The problem is, from 1977 on, 1997, let's get the decade right, 1997 onwards, there was a deliberate attempt at removing power from elected representatives, a deliberate attempt at removing power from Parliament. And it was not simply an attempt, it was incredibly successful. If you actually look at the New Labour programme, beginning with the independence of the Bank of England, beginning with devolution, beginning with the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights, all of those things create this blob that we're talking about. Remember when we were talking about what Robert was attacking, the malfunctioning of the police, the malfunctioning of the Crown Prosecution Service, and all the rest of it. Because what every one of them do, I mean, look, just take the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. It controls the most important lever of the economy. How was Margaret Thatcher able to take control of that malfunctioning economy in 1979? Because Geoffrey Howe could control interest rates.
Yes.
No government can do that now. We've removed the most important single monetary lever from the hands of government. And as we can see over the last where are we now? 14 years since 2010. The Bank of England has performed shockingly, absolutely shockingly. Again, it's not simply the Bank of England where we have a body of so-called experts, but it's a single-issue body of experts. We now have climate change determined by the Climate Change Committee. Or rather not climate change, if only they could. They think they can. The whole response to climate change. We have English nature. Well, it's English nature, of course, that is responsible for saying absurdly that newts and bats take precedence over human beings. It's English nature that determines that vast tracts of land can't be built on because of some form of whatever it is, potassium or saline penetration or whatever. In other words, and there's one thing, as we saw from COVID is the moment at which all of this reaches its apogee, its concentrated essence, which is why people like Starmer and whatever are so keen on it. We were ruled by a committee of public safety. We were ruled by we were ruled by SAGE. And there were very respectable scientists, all of them. Not one of them behaved respectably. They all invoked fear, they all lied, they all used false statistics, they all enjoyed closing down freedoms for what we can now see was no conceivable benefit whatever. This is what happens when you give power to a single issue committee of experts. The art of government is an art of balance. It's an art of weighing one thing against another, which is why if you have a committee of experts, the tendency is to think there's only one answer. It's why we have rhetoric. It's why we have debate. It's why we were governed well, because we were genuinely governed by parliamentary debate, by the weighing of one set of ideas against another set. This is how it should be done. And again, one of the dreadful things that so what we saw in those years, and of course it continued. Again, it was not simply that government was the proper instruments of government were taken out of the hands of people who are responsible. I mean, can we think about what's happened? Response to climate change. The control of the natural environment or human interaction with the natural environment and interest rates, they're three of the principal levers of government. None of them is directly amenable to parliamentary control. The NHS isn't. We have a chief executive of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard. And let me tell a little story out of school. I happen to be friendly with the chief executive of one of our very largest pharmaceutical organizations. We were having dinner. We got onto this subject. He said, "Do you know what? I wouldn't employ Pritchard as a branch manager."
Really?
And she, in theory, is in charge of the NHS. Now, this means that we have politicians who are responsible to Parliament, but they are actually pulling levers that don't work. So we see this everywhere. But there's more than this. We've lost control of language. Things like human rights sound lovely. But universal human rights, European human rights, what does that mean? Who gives them authority? Well, just 1 second. It's really important we get this, because we've got to recapture language. If you say there's such a thing as universal human rights, it means you do not determine what the law is. The reason we in Britain have obeyed the law is because of the idea of Parliament, the fact we are all represented in Parliament. Parliament makes the laws, therefore we have participated in the process of lawmaking. But if you believe there is this thing called universal human rights, they're above. They're beyond the state. Therefore, the state can't control them. This is why we can't deal with immigration. And it's even worse than that. If there are universal human rights, there must be a universal human being. So there's nobody who is a foreigner. This is why we have organisations like the Refugee Council, paid for by you and me, which tell us all the time that these people coming in, they're just like you and me. This remarkable fact that this second-generation Rwandan who was guilty of... better not say that again. This second-generation Rwandan who is accused of the terrible murder of the children, in the little girls in Southport, was. Do you remember the public line was that he was Welsh because he was born there? So the notion that we are different, the notion that we are a product of different cultures, the notion that the state owes a different duty to us, the taxpayer. We've entirely abolished that notion. Somebody lands here, and apparently the cost of every refugee who comes in illegally is the same as sending your child to Eton. It's £40,000 a year. And those are merely the immediate costs.
With this,
so in other words, what we have done, we have created a structure in which the whole pattern of our democracy has been broken. This is why, Peter, have you noticed there's a sudden new word walking around?
Which is?
Populism. Why do we need this funny new word, populism? Because what does populism mean? Well, I think it means things that are popular. I remember in my own...
Just in the French, it was always derogatory, wasn't it? Popular.
Let me just tease it. Let's just tease this. I remember in my glory days in television, when I would return to some obscure provincial university in my nice long wheelbase Daimler, and you could sense the rage of my fellow academics. The standard denunciation of me was, "Oh, he's just a popular historian," to which my response was, "Well, I suppose it's better than being an unpopular one." So remember, populism is just the Latin for democracy. Democracy comes from the Greek for the people, demos, and populism just comes from the Latin for the people, populus or whatever. Right, okay. Now, why? Why have we had to invent this new word? Because the blob has captured the meaning of democracy. Democracy is redefined, and was redefined by the Attorney General in a speech recently, as essentially the protection of minorities. You and I know the proper meaning of democracy is government of the majority. This has been completely stood on its head. The very word democracy has been captured, which is why we've got to have this new term, which is not, and it's completely extraordinary, that the idea that if an opinion is popular, it's somehow a bad thing. This is the problem of the rule by self-appointed, self-selected, deeply malfunctioning elites with a radically different value set from the mass of the population, which is where we are now.
It's helped by the general contempt for majority of the population.
Totally.
I mean, I would say that's where it derives from equally. Just a absolute, well, I'd say hatred, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a peculiarly English thing. And this was identified more than half a century ago by George Orwell, who talks about the peculiar contempt of the English intellectual for the English. I mean, you see it the most recent example is that fat, shiny, smug woman, Emily Thornberry, on White Van Man, and how disgusting the flying of the Union Jack. And of course, the profound hypocrisy now of Starmer's Labour Party draping themselves in Union Jacks wherever they can, when, as we all know, at least half the party would prefer to be burning them.
David, can I ask you, therefore, with what you're talking about, with these particular, these massively important constitutional areas, what we could call a restoration, if you like, of what was before,
Well, first we've got to have a great repeal.
Oh, yes, right. No, the great repeal.
This is exactly right. Again, let's go back to that 79 manifesto. This is exactly what Thatcher did. She set out what she would undo first, what legislation she would undo, how she would bring inflation under control. And it was very painful medicine. Very painful medicine. And there is going to have to be something similar. My own view would be that you actually, and it would probably be easier to do it at a stroke rather than to do it bit by bit. I would repeal the lot. There would be the most extraordinary dust-up with the so-called establishment.
But there was for Thatcher.
There was indeed for Thatcher. The 365 economists, all of whom were wrong.
Yes,
exactly that. Exactly that sort of resistance. The disgraceful refusal of Oxford to give her an honorary degree. I mean, you would expect that. This will not be an easy path. It will not be strewn with rose petals.
It was some of the things said about her. We talk about contempt. Actually, I just spoke about contempt. Some of the things said about Thatcher in the 80s by academics like Baroness Warnock and people like this, Jonathan Miller, do you remember the director? Quite unbelievable when you hear them now. You know, that she wore vulgar clothes from Marks and Spencer's, that her manner was rather low, things like this.
Of course.
I'm quite but the problem is
the spectacular snobbery.
Yes, but they were driven crazy by the fact that she didn't care. She wasn't aspirant to be them. She just didn't care. What's most important for us, really, in a way, with this election in mind, is has this resonated, what you're talking about, what you have described to us, has it resonated with the people standing for the Tory party leadership?
I think the answer is yes with both of them. I think with Badenoch, she's at an earlier stage. I think she's analysing the cultural consequences. I mean, she's very aware of all the sort of things that the New Culture Forum is. She's consciously anti-woke. She has been brave in taking on things like transgenderism. She is, of course, able to be very brave on the subject of critical race theory or whatever, because she has the advantage of being black. Not that it will spare her bitter denunciation about being a coconut or an Oreo cookie or any of these kind of things, the usual black outside but white inside. But she's shown very considerable bravery in all of that. Jenrick, I think, has got a much more substantial understanding. I think, and again, it's very important. This is an argument that I am very happy to discuss with you. I think politics is upstream from culture. That's to say, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that politics, the constitution, is architectonic. It actually shapes things. And once upon a time, this would have seemed a statement so obvious that it wasn't worth making. Now we've really got to reiterate it, just at the point that we're losing it. I mean, if we go back, again, the debate about what is the nature of our politics, does it arise from Judeo-Christianity, to which my view is absolutely not. How could it possibly? How can divine revelation actually give you a system of politics which depends on having a government and an opposition? How can it possibly?
We might have a few comments about that.
We could do another session on that. It arises directly instead from the Greco-Roman tradition, and if we go right back to the beginning of that tradition, in the Athens of the Peloponnesian War, of the Great War between Athens and Sparta, the great speech over the Athenian dead, which is given by Pericles, when he talks about why Athens will win. By the way, it didn't. But why he talks about why it will win, he talks about the constitution. He talks about the fact that they are a democracy, that they make the law which they obey. He talks about the existence of freedom, despite the fact, of course, half the people were slaves, despite the fact that women weren't allowed to vote. There were free men. He says we're a society which can value talent. Nevertheless, if a poor man has got talent, he can lead. Equally, we do not exclude the rich just because they are rich. We are fruitful, we are creative, we do not discriminate, we let each one lead his own life. In other words, he sees, do you know what? It's exactly what Churchill did. Churchill, at the beginning of the First World War, there's a quite extraordinary moment when he's wandering, they're in the lobby of, still there of course, they're in the lobby of the House, and there's a young MP. Churchill goes up to him, they talk. The chamber's empty. It's dark. Presumably, I don't know, would there have been gas? There probably is an electric light by this point, but very little. And he takes him into the darkened chamber of the House of Commons. And he says, that's why we're going to win. That's why we're going to defeat Germany. And do you know what? He was right. If you look again in the Second World War, what is striking is that Britain was capable of a much more radical war effort than dictatorial Germany, because people thought they were in it together. We've lost that. We are losing it. We're losing it with the divisions in our society. We're losing it because we've forgotten our past. But we're losing it above all because the essential machinery, that machinery of a participatory politics in which the governed and governed are not separate. The one becomes the other and the one joins the other. And we've got to recover that. Otherwise, we really are lost.
It was a very, I think it's a very good observation about our attitude to the war. You mentioned there that wonderful image, by the way, of Churchill, which we can end on. But at the same time, it's a very simple thing. Compared to the centrally controlled, German regime, our propaganda was essentially kind of true in the sense that it was, look, we're going to go, we might go down, but we're not going to go down without a fight. Do you know?
No, it wasn't. Churchill, no, you're wrong. Churchill was completely the opposite. Do you know what Churchill said?
Oh, fighting on the beaches, we will never surrender. In other words, we will just keep on, even though the implication was that we're strong enough to keep going on, but that not, when you look at how Germany presented itself, as absolutely imperial power, the possibilities of defeat do not exist effectively.
But so that was what Churchill said. Right at the may I remind you, right at the beginning, when Churchill becomes Prime Minister in 1940, he declares war aims. What are they? Victory.
Victory at all costs.
Victory at all costs. Churchill, right from the beginning, understood that you had to have unconditional surrender. And remember, this is Churchill learning from history. This is Churchill learning the mistakes of 1918. This is Churchill learning indeed from his experience as a historian. I mean, I've argued this before. I made 3 films on it, The Churchills, plug, in which I was looking at how Churchill's writing of the biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, who leads Britain to that extraordinary triumph over the France of Louis XIV, shapes him. And this is the point at which Churchill realizes, which he hadn't done fully in the First World War, that leading a great international coalition, which is what he did, is as much about diplomacy as about military skill. He learns that what the nature of an absolutist regime is, the relentless expansion abroad, the persecution of minorities at home, and he learns how it's got to be destroyed. So I think that what is so striking about Churchill is this absolute clarity of purpose, this understanding, which again, dare I say it, we should be applying to the Middle East. The reason the Middle East is in the catastrophic mess that it is that war has never been given a chance. What is doing now, you have a figure, Netanyahu, who is, I think, the equivalent in stature of Churchill, though he's more of the skills of a Bismarck. He has that same kind of brutal understanding of politics, and the skill of a Bismarck in playing every opponent off against everybody else. What's happened in the last year or so is totally extraordinary. But we need to understand this. And again, so this is a really good point to bring the whole thing round into a circle. Who the Conservatives choose as their next leader will be absolutely fundamentally important. Because as we've seen with Churchill, as we're seeing with Netanyahu, and as we saw with Thatcher, individuals do matter. There isn't just a great flux and flow of events. Yes, there is that tide in the affairs of men, but as Shakespeare said, there are those who can catch it. There are those who can command it. There are those who can even change its direction.
David, perfect. And thank you. Well, you must come back. Well, you will come back, I'm sure. And give your.
I'm suggesting you've got a little collar and leave.
No. Give your verdict on what, say, like the first 6 months of the new Tory leader. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on, as always. David Starkey, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we shall see you next week. In the meantime, do have a good and safe week, won't you? Bye-bye.